もしやコスモでは。
Cosmo needs me free.
Cosmo AP Luxury Sports.
Well, after messing with door solenoids, sheet metal, power window actuators, and all that kind of crap, it's finally time to do something fun, which is build the engine. So the first step to building an engine is to set the rotors aside, install all the seals, but the most important part of that is clearancing the side seals first. Okay, I previously mentioned that I wanted to use GSL-SE rotors, but the GSL-SE rotors that I have a worn groove. It's worn past tolerance. This is a 1.0 or a 0.101 millimeter gauge that I can slip in there, meaning that it's worn. The groove has V'd out. So what I will use are my original Cosmo rotors, which are so new that there's no real point even trying to measure it. They're just brand new. The annoying part is that the Cosmo rotors have a 9.2 to 1 compression. The SE rotors have a 9.4 to 1 compression, which is why I wanted to originally use them. But in the real world, probably not much of a difference. Okay, what I mean about clearancing the side seals is that Mazda ships these seals quite long so that they can be ground to fit each rotor, which is different. So what has to happen is this side has to be slowly ground down to fit between these two corner seals. Now, the official clearance from Mazda is between 0.4 and 0.5 millimeters. But after building a lot of these engines, I've sort of developed a feel for this, and my official clearance is to grind them until they just barely fit and move freely. The way I normally do this is to clamp a Dremel tool to the side of the workbench with a grinding stone on it, and then I can easily grind the end of the seal while going back over to the rotor to recheck it. Each end of the seal has a slightly different shape. This is the side from the factory that's supposed to fit against the corner seal, and this side is the side that's designed to be ground. There's about an 1/8 inch of extra seal on here, so for the first little while it goes quickly, and then you have to go really slow and try to maintain the same angle as the other seal.
Notice how I'm trying to cut the seal at the proper angle to match the other side. Also, I'm just slightly pressing it against the stone. I'm not just pushing it on there with all my might. Pushing it on there would overheat the edge of the seal, causing it to glow red hot, and would probably affect the metallurgical compound of the seal. They're sintered iron and probably don't take well to being run orange hot on a grinder.
After a few minutes of grinding, the first one is nearly done. It's very, very close to fitting in the groove now, so now is the time that I have to pay a lot of attention to keeping the angle proper on the end that I'm grinding. Just needs a little more grinding.
At the Mazda factory, the workers assembling rotary engines have seals available in several different lengths, so all they have to do is pick the seal appropriate to the rotor. Unlike the general public, who has to go through this ridiculous procedure of clearancing every seal. It really would be nice if they were available at the dealer in several different lengths.
This whole process is a matter of grinding just a tiny bit off at a time, refitting the seal, and checking to see if it fits in the groove. It's almost done. Notice how I'm holding the seal to the grinding wheel at a very specific angle. This is trying to maintain the same angle on this end of the seal as the other side. If the angle is wrong, but the seal is within clearance, it's still wrong.
I'm lightly tapping the seal against the grinding stone and checking often to make sure that I'm maintaining the correct angle.
I'm right at the threshold now where it's just almost done. I now have to work very, very slowly and be very, very careful to maintain this angle, because at this point I don't have enough room on the seal to regrind the angle if I screw it up. At this point, I'm stopping every few seconds to check the fit, because it's right on the threshold of fitting. In fact, I'm going to put a side seal spring in there so that once it finally does fit, I can get it back out. Even though I'm putting springs and seals in right now, I'm going to take them out and lubricate them with Vaseline before the engine goes back together. This seal is one more touch with the grinder from being done. It fits in the groove and the ends match up really well to the corner seals, but it doesn't pop back out without picking it out. So it doesn't float freely, which it needs to do. One quick more tag with the grinder and it should be ready. And that's the first side seal clearance. I literally touched it to the grinder a few more times, and now it fits perfectly in the groove and can be easily removed, reinserted, and floats freely. So now I just have to do it 11 more times, and these rotors will then be ready for installation. I have 11 more of those seals to do before I can start finally assembling the rotors. So I'm just popping in the next corner seal, and I'm going to turn the camera off and then do all of these side seals.
It looks like I'm being very brutal to the seal, but really I'm just removing that excess 1/8 inch of material so I can get to the fine tuning.
Well, that's the last seal on the rear rotor. Now it's time to start on the front. A little bit of tape will hold these seals in place while the rotor gets handled. Ultimately, before of course it goes into the engine, it's going to need the rest of the seals installed, and all the side seals and springs have to come out to be lubricated anyway. This tape is just to hold everything in place while it's being handled. The rotors have been stored in sealed Ziploc bags to keep the rust off of them. A little bit of rust in the bowls is to be expected just from washing, but that's really not a concern. Since older 13B rotors are asymmetrical in the bowl, I'm making sure to mark them clearly as to which is front and which is back so they don't get mixed up in the build. I'm not sure what the consequences would be of mixing up a front and rear rotor. I doubt there would be too grave of a situation happening, but it's still not something that you want to do, because Mazda clearly designed these to be directional. Newer rotors are not asymmetrical after about, I want to say 1984. Pop in the springs and then the corner seals. These are just in for mock-up while the seals are being clearanced. Before it goes back in the engine, all this stuff will come out and get lubricated properly. I like making a little mark on the end that gets ground, just so that I know when to stop and when I need to start grinding slowly to start fitting the seal. Almost. That's seal number 1 on the front rotor. 5 more to go.
Clearancing side seals is a tedious process of grinding, checking the fit, grinding, checking the fit, grinding, checking the fit. It takes about 2 hours to do each engine.
The last side seal on the front rotor is now clearanced, so the rest of the assembly on the rotors can now take place. Now that the side seals are clearanced, it's time to start assembling the rotors. So the first step in that is assembling the O-rings to the O-ring carriers. All it takes is to spooge up the O-ring with a good helping of Vaseline to get them all nice and slippery, and then slowly roll it into the O-ring carrier. These are Viton O-rings supplied in the Atkins kit. I personally prefer Mazda factory O-rings, but there's really nothing wrong with the Viton rings. So just make sure that it's all Vaselined up, and they are also very, very sharp, so try to avoid cutting yourself. That's one. And now the outer O-ring is a little bit more complicated because the ring doesn't go on the outside, it gets pushed into the inside. So a lot of Vaseline is necessary to keep it in place. Just kind of shove it in. Push it in with your fingers. Try not to cut yourself. These are a little bit larger, so it does take a sec to get it in. There you go. Very carefully spread the Vaseline around, again avoiding cutting yourself. Like most enjoyable things in life, it takes about half a tub of Vaseline to complete this task. That's 2, and I just have to do 6 more. So this is the last 2 O-rings that need to be assembled. You're going to go through a fair amount of Vaseline if you do this, and do not buy cheap Vaseline. Buy the good stuff, because the cheap stuff doesn't stick nearly as well as the good stuff, and I've actually lost an engine that was assembled with cheap Vaseline when during the build process a corner seal slipped out of a rotor, ended up in the ended up in the intake port. Nobody knew until the engine was started up. Then it, for some reason, didn't make compression on one rotor, and we couldn't figure it out until it was torn down again, and saw the damage done to the rotor housing, rotor, and iron. This is the last internal ring to be installed, and then the rest of the rotors can be set up. Just carefully push this in. Try not to twist it. You want to pooch out a little. There we go. Very, very sharp. Back in the holder, and there's a complete set of oil control rings assembled. I've popped all the seals out of the rotor, keeping them in order, of course, so that I can just give them a little bit of Vaseline to hold them in place and to lubricate them. I didn't do this when I initially clearanced the seals because otherwise the Vaseline would get completely covered in dust and junk. Then it's just a matter of putting them back in, made considerably more difficult by the fact that everything is now gooey. These are FD corner seal springs, the standard upgrade, and FD corner seals as well. bit of Vaseline gets spread into the side seal grooves to retain the spring and the side seal. The springs go in pointing up, and each side seal just gets pushed into place. And now a crap ton of Vaseline gets applied to each side seal to hold it in position. As well as the corner seals. Can't use too much. In fact, there are very few areas in life where you can use too much Vaseline. Yuck. Nasty. Now it's time for the oil O-ring springs. These are color-coded and directional. So the blue ones go in the front rotor non-gear side, lining up the round hole with the little divot in the groove. Where's my other hole? There it is. And then the O-rings get pushed into place, lining the notches up with the little tang on the spring. Well as one can do that. Just kind of push in. You will cut yourself. Oh, there we go. Little bastard, get in there. Yep. One. And two. This is the reason I do not like these Viton seals, because they are a bitch to get in place. Factory seals just slide right in. After screwing with the oil seals for about 10 minutes, I finally got them in place. So now I'm just doing the same thing with this side of the rotor. I've turned it over, lubed up the seals, and now putting them back into place.
While assembling rotors, it's very difficult not to get Vaseline just absolutely everywhere, and then everything you touch for the next half hour is greasy.
Now this side of the front rotor gets the white oil control ring springs. Helps if I put them in the right groove. There we are. Be sure to get the little round part in the notch. Oops, that's the way. And then I can spend another 20 minutes pushing in these silly Viton oil control rings. The inner goes in fairly easily. It's the outer that's the problem. Using an old seal to spread out the force helps a lot. There we go. And maybe this outer one will go in easier. That one actually kind of went in. Now I'm going to pop in the apex seals with the corner apex seal piece facing opposite of the gear. Go. One. Sometimes they take a little bit of finagling to get them in. 2. So everything has to line up. 3. And this side of the rotor gets the corner seal rubber buttons. The other side does not, because the buttons would be in the way of sliding the spring in place once the rotor is installed in the engine. There we go. Can be a little bit of an annoyance to get those in.
That's like a 1 in a million shot. The corner button fell right into the tub of Vaseline.
And 3. And that rotor is all done. I just have to do the exact same thing to the rear rotor. The rear rotor is exactly the same as the front rotor, except basically everything's reversed. The white oil spring goes on the non-gear side, and the blue oil springs go on the geared side. And I suspect that this rotor will also be a hassle when installing the control rings. So I'll turn the camera off and not subject anyone to further of that. This is the last oil control ring. Save the inner one for last because they go in so easily compared to these stupid outer rings. This is the last time I buy Viton oil control rings. In. This guy another push because it's pooching out. There we go. 1 apex seal. And a big gob of Vaseline to hold it in place. 2 apex seals. And an equally big gob of Vaseline to hold it in place. 3 apex seals, and a slightly smaller gob of Vaseline to hold it in place. Yuck. And the final corner seal button goes in place. And now the rotor's finally done. The tedious rotor assembly is now complete. So it's time to actually get down to the joy of assembling the engine. I've laid out everything on the bench in order, which is needed for assembly, starting with the front, the housings, irons, rotors, etc., going all the way back to the rear stationary gear. Additionally, I have 2 cans of brake cleaner, some copper gasket goo, Hylamar, Vaseline, Royal Purple, Max Tough, assembly lubricant, and the Mazda O-ring kit needed to assemble the engine. I've mounted the front iron to the engine stand, and now I'm just applying a little bit of this Royal Purple Max Tough engine assembly lube to the stationary gear so that I can slide it in place. It's a friction fit, so it takes a little bit of wiggling to get it in here. The last thing you want to do is just start wailing on it with a hammer. There we go. Just take a little bit of tapping from underneath. And one bolt gets installed just to hold it in place. Flip this thing over. The front rotor is next, but first a little bit of Royal Purple Max Tough engine assembly lubricant on both the surface of the iron and the gears. Spread it around a little. Yep. Then the front rotor can be dropped into place. I like to put the apex of it facing down. Look at that, I got it first try. It has to land within the rotor running area. If it doesn't, the housing will never fit on. Get a little bit of lube inside the bearings before I slide the eccentric shaft in, because I could have lubed the stationary gear before I put the rotor in place. Work it into the bearing. A little bit more in there. Never have too much lube. And the eccentric shaft can now be carefully lowered into place. It may take a little bit of wiggling of both the shaft and the rotor to get everything lined up, but eventually it will just kind of fall into place. There we go. Before I forget, I'm going to put a little bit more assembly lube around these upper oil control rings, and a little bit more down inside the bearing area. The two dowel pins are next. They just go right in the hole. The coolant O-rings have to be now installed in the housings. They get a coat of Hylomar. It's a lot easier to do this with two people so that one person can spooge the Hylomar onto the person installing the O-rings, keep the bottle and everything else from getting completely, horribly mangled. A little bit more. Thank you. This is a horrible, horrible process.
It may look like I'm roughhousing the O-ring, but actually I'm being very gentle. They do tear, so be careful.
Okay, the inner coolant O-ring now goes into place. The seam ends up right around the intake ports. It's actually acceptable for it to be anywhere between the intake ports and 12 o'clock. I always just push it against the intake ports for consistency. And the inner O-ring goes in fairly easily. The Hylomar holds it in place, and you just have to make sure you didn't twist it like I did right there. A little bit of Hylomar, please. Thank you. A little bit of Hylomar will kind of hold it in position. All done. Okay, the outer coolant O-ring is next, and the procedure is basically the same, except this doesn't have any particular orientation. Give me some Hylomar. Oh, lovely. It's like this Hylomar is nowhere near as good as the Hylomar you used to be able to buy. The original Hylomar didn't dry into this tacky mess. It just stayed spoogey the entire time. This thing. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay. Okay, this is the one that really sucks because it doesn't want to go in place and it always wants to pop back out. So you have to start slowly, and it kind of requires 3 hands when you get to the end. It's best that you finish on a corner, because that gives you the most chance of being able to stretch it in place. There, it's in place. Put a Halomar, and then the next O-ring that gets gooed up is the dowel pin O-ring. Just a little bit of Halomar will hold it in place during assembly. Yuck. I gotta clean my hands. The housing gets dropped down next, but first a skim coat of silicone sealant on the legs so that the oil doesn't seep from the oil pan to the outside of the engine. Get out of the way, I guess. And the other leg. And now the housing can be carefully slipped over the dowels and down onto the engine. Kind of jumped the gun on installing these coolant seals. I'm not sure why I did that because I still have to pop in the apex seal corner pieces and pop in the apex seal springs. Now I can slip in the apex seal springs.
The springs are installed with the mouth facing the apex seal and thus the crown facing the rotor.
Sometimes they need a little bit of persuasion, but most of the time they just pop down with a screwdriver. Sometimes they need to be worked back and forth with some pliers, but it will go in place. There we go. And they just hook on the corner piece and hold it in place. Atkins must have a different design on the bottom of their seals. And finally, the little rubber corner button goes in place. A little bit of wiggling, but slide into place eventually. There we go. Don't forget the little O-ring here, otherwise you're going to be puking oil as soon as the engine starts. And I've just put the silicone goo around the bottom legs. It is now time to put the intermediate iron on. This requires 2 people. The intermediate housing is next, and this just requires 2 people. One to lift the eccentric shaft up about 1 inch, the second to lower the housing down. Just a little bit of wiggling. There we go. And then they get dropped in unison about now. Intermediate's in place. The rear rotor is next, but first some Royal Purple Max Tough engine assembly lubricant. Move up the old shaft a little. Very important in life to always maintain a proper amount of lubrication on your shaft. Time for the rear rotor. The gear side goes up, the non-gear side obviously then goes down. There we go. That's where it goes. Before the rear housing gets dropped into place, just put some sealant on the legs like before. The O-rings have already been Halomar'd into the housing, so everything should just drop in place now. Almost forgot the dowels. A little bit of assembly lube on the dowel helps the housing slide on easier. And now it's time for the rear housing, which just slide on once the dowels are lined up. In place. And as before, we just pop in the apex seal corner pieces. And then the springs. Ow. There we go. Yeah, sometimes they're a pain in the ass. The rubber plugs get pushed into place. This is really hard to do with your fingers covered in Vaseline and Hylamar. 2, 3. And before the rear iron gets put into place, we'll goo up this rotor with some assembly lube.
That's Royal Purple Max Tough engine assembly lube.
And the rear iron just gets dropped on the dowels. Am I even close? 1, 2. And now the only thing remaining is the rear stationary gear. So we'll lube up the area and slip it in. Again, this is a friction fit, so they're pretty tight, and additionally, unless the rotor's in exactly the perfect position, it can take a little bit of wiggling to get these things in. I've already lubed up the bearing. Here's hoping it just slips right on. After a little bit of wiggling, I found the right spot, so it should go in place. There we go. Before the tension bolts go in, they need a dowty seal installed at the head of each. This actually seals the coolant passage at the rear iron. And then this is the long bolt that goes on the outside of the engine. It really doesn't need a seal, but one comes in the kit, so I always just toss it on. Each bolt gets some assembly lube on the treads and some more assembly lube at the dowty seal. Then gets shoved in the engine. The long bolt with the M on the head goes in this position here. Before being torqued, these bolts just get run down snugly by hand just to seat all of the seals. I always do this in a staggered pattern. And as you tighten down one side, the other side will loosen up as the seals compress. I should mention that these are GSL-SE tension bolts. They are much thicker than the Cosmo bolts. Mazda has alternated between thick and thin bolts for some reason. For example, Series 4 engines got thin bolts, where Series 5 and above engines got thick bolts. To make it easier to torque the bolts down, I always write the torque sequence on the bolts with marker. 14. This avoids a considerable amount of confusion which will occur if you don't do this. 17. These bolts get torqued down in 3 stages. The first is to 10 foot-pounds. 7. I prefer the old school beam type torque wrench. The second torque stage is to 20 foot-pounds. Don't be surprised if you find a few of these loose, because as you tighten the bolts, everything becomes compressed, which ends up releasing tension on some of the other bolts. 20. The final torque is to 28 foot-pounds. And final bolt 18 and torqued to 28 foot-pounds. Now I just like to check each one to make sure that it's been torqued and I didn't miss one. Cool. Bitchin'. Sweet. Wicked. Crouch gapingly awesome. Orgasmic. Whoop. That's why we check, because number 6 was skipped. 28. That one's okay. 14 is good. 6 is good, or possibly 9. 12 is good, which brings us back to the beginning. 8. And I know these ones are okay because I just did them. The tension bolts are torqued. I usually give the rear stationary bolts a little dab of Loctite before I put them in. It's not really required, but little blue Loctite never hurt anybody. Run these guys down. Kind of doing a random crisscross pattern here. Remember that band, Crisscross? The kids that wore their clothes on backwards? Now, the torque on these rear stationary gear bolts is 17 foot-pounds. A lot less than you'd think. That one's still really loose. I usually just go 20 and call it a day. Done. And check them. And done. Even though a rotary short block is pretty light, this is when it really helps to have someone else in the shop. Because, you know, it still weighs more than I do. Gyms are overrated. The major assembly of the short block is done. Now it's time to set the eccentric shaft end play and install the front cover. Before the front cover can go on, the front stack has to be assembled in mock-up and the eccentric end play measured. So the first step in that is to remove the temporary bolt that holds the front stationary gear in place. The front stack goes together in mock-up first. I put a little bit of petroleum jelly on this washer just for extra lubrication. It goes chamfer side down on the eccentric shaft. Then next is one of the Tritan bearings. Just put a little bit of assembly lube on this. Probably on the other side as well. Good idea. Then the spacer. This is a V spacer, which almost all engines are. The spacer goes inside the Tritan bearing. Then the plate lining up these holes. The front stationary gear bolts get installed and torqued to 17 foot-pounds. The next Tritan bearing gets a little bit of lube, then gets slipped over the shaft and positioned so that it's on the outside of the spacer, which is really the only place it can kind of go. A little bit of petroleum jelly is used to adhere the thin washer to the counterweight, and the counterweight gets slipped over, lining up the keyways. The oil pump drive gear is next. Then the distributor / crank sensor gear. The gear goes chamfer side down. This is very important. If it's chamfer side up, timing will always be off. There we go. Then finally, the key is slipped in place to lock all that stuff together. Now the front hub gets slipped in place. This is the hub from the Cosmo, which, as you recall, has the pulleys riveted to it. Then finally, the eccentric shaft hub bolt. The front nut then needs to just be spun down until snug. Have a helper jam a screwdriver between the front iron such that it'll block the counterweight as it comes around. And then the front bolt can be torqued to 90 foot-pounds. Ready? .90 foot-pounds. Once the bolt's torqued down, the engine gets rotated to seat, well, basically everything. This is the first time this engine has ever been turned, so here we go. There we go. A dial indicator is used to measure the end plate clearance. It's just clamped onto the engine with a magnetic base, placed on the eccentric shaft main bolt. As long as the eccentric shaft is pushed all the way down, then zeroed. So as zero as it needs to be, I think. End play is measured by placing a pry bar underneath the front counterweight, pushing down on the counterweight, then lightly pushing up on the pry bar. You can see by the gauge that this engine has between 20 and 25 thousandths of an inch end play, and it's within the spec of 16 thousandths to 28 thousandths. So the V-spacer that I installed can be kept when the front stack is assembled for real. If it's too loose, a shorter spacer has to be installed, and if it's too tight, a thicker spacer has to be installed. But 99% of the time, an engine can be assembled with a V-spacer. With the end plate set, the front stack can be disassembled so the front cover can be installed. Removal is reverse of installation. When I assemble these oil pumps, I like to pack in a whole ton of Vaseline so that they don't dry start. Now, a lot of people will tell you that these gears have to be lined up in any specific way, but anybody who says that can be completely ignored because it doesn't matter in the least. Oh, that's really, really gooey. And the oil pump just oozes into place. I always like to use a little bit of red Loctite on these oil pump bolts because they only get torqued to 5 to 7 foot-pounds. And even though they have a lock washer, the Loctite is a little bit of extra insurance. Because one of those things that sucks is your oil pump coming loose at like 9,000 RPM on the back straight of some racetrack. 5 foot-pounds. 5 foot-pounds. 5. 5. Now it's time for the real assembly of the front stack. So plenty of assembly lube and the eccentric washer, some more lube, and a Torrington bearing, then the spacer, and a little bit of lube. Then the thrust plate, making sure to line up the holes. I like to use a little bit of blue Loctite on these front stationary gear bolts. It's not required in the manual, but I just figure a little bit of extra insurance never hurt. I could just imagine the awesome destruction if one of these was to back out and hit the rotating counterweight. 17 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Torrington bearing is next. A little bit of lubrication. Then the front counterweight with washer. I'm slipping in the eccentric shaft key so that I can locate the oil pump drive gear. The oil pump drive gear is next, but the annoyance with this is you have to line up the key in the oil pump and the key in the eccentric shaft and make very, very certain not to push this key out of the oil pump. Otherwise, the engine will start and there will be no oil pressure. There's a little slack in the chain, which helps a little, but realistically you just have to keep moving the pump until you get it in place. Far off on line. Got it. Just make sure that the key didn't disappear when it got pressed on. The lock washer gets installed first. Then I like to use a little bit of red Loctite. And the bolt gets torqued to 35 foot-pounds while holding the engine from moving with the screwdriver. A sec. The lock washer then gets bent into place to hold the nut. Once again, the chamfer goes down. I'm just going to clean this gasket surface up one more time before I install the front cover. Before the front cover gets installed, I'm going to put in the new front eccentric shaft seal, because it's a big pain in the ass to do after the front cover has been installed on the engine. little bit of Vaseline lubes up the seal and makes it a lot easier to install. Just kind of presses in place and get started with your hand.
Once the seal is started in the hole, it then gets carefully tapped into place with a soft-faced hammer.
And it just gets tapped level with the surface. Done. I like to put a little bit of gasket goo on the mating surfaces for the front cover, except at the metering oil pump hole, so that the goo doesn't clog up the hole. Clogged holes often suck.
Throughout this build, I've been using Permatex Ultra Copper Sensor Safe RTV sealant.
Gasket goes into place, lining up the dowel pins. Into the goo a little. Clean out this hole. Then the front cover O-ring.
Another very thin layer of RTV gets spread over the gasket, which not only helps it seal against the front cover, but also makes it easy to remove should the cover need to come off.
Front cover can now be dropped into place, lining up the dowel holes and putting it down onto the gasket. There we go. I always use stainless steel bolts in place of the original fasteners on non-critical hardware. They just look better. Run these suckers down. Then they get torqued to 17 foot-pounds. A little bit of Vaseline holds the new copper front sealing washer in place and lubricates it as this bolt is turned. This Vaseline is actually quite important. If you don't do this, you'll probably damage the washer, then have an front eccentric oil leak. Pain in the ass. After lubing the front snout of the eccentric shaft hub, it can just be pushed into place. Spin that sucker down. Years ago I made this tool for bolting down these front hubs. It's just one of the extra rings from one of these pulley sets with a bar welded to it. Just bolts to the front hub and holds it in place for tightening. And now this gets torqued to 90 foot-pounds for the final time. Ready? Got it? Yep. 90. Now that the front of the engine is assembled, I consider this short block done. It can now be safely turned on its side without fear of the Tritan Bearing falling, because the front hub is now locked into place. Let's see the V8 guys move their engine on a stand with one hand.